It was no big deal that people from one country came to another, settled down, and in many cases, through military means, they had annexed this particular new land and maybe ruled over its previous inhabitants. I am not deliberately using the word original because the question of original inhabitants is itself a very dicey issue. Who is an original inhabitant? Who is the Bhumiputra or Bhumikanna of a particular place? Because man has lived and left countless areas. So it is very difficult to call A or B the original inhabitant of a particular place. Nobody knows. Now, as I was telling you, that from the Renaissance onwards, through the Enlightenment, till the mid-20th century, there was an endless stream of settlement and governance. Usually from the West, because they have been historically the more dominant of the two, the East and the West. Western people, and especially from Europe, this led to the coinage of the word Eurocentrism. Europe at the center of everything. So, Europeans had gone to various places in Asia, Africa, America, the West Indies, the Pacific places, the Pacific Islands, Pacific Ocean countries, and so on and so forth. The Indian Ocean islands and countries, and so on and so forth. So, what I am trying to point out is that this wave of colonization had something unique to it. What was that uniqueness? Earlier also, you think about Alexander the Great from Macedonia. He too came. Defeated the Persians, came to India, but left, leaving his conquest half done, half complete. They also came, and trade and commerce flowed between nations. Even in the days of yore. What I want to point out is that so far as this particular phase of colonization is concerned, so far as this particular phase of settlement of new places, governing new places is concerned, there was something unique. I am obviously talking about the phase between, say, the 15th, 16th to the 20th century, when Europe was the conquering race. Europeans. What was that particular difference? Number one, I have told you or hinted at, was the ideological baggage. For the first time, man went from one place to another to rule, to plunder, to subjugate. with a particular ideological mission. How and why? Because they wanted new countries as suppliers of raw materials and markets for their finished goods. This is number one. Number two, trade and commerce had shown the Europeans that large places in Asia, Africa, the Pacific, the Americas and all that could provide them with untold amount of raw materials as well as an extraordinary market for their wares, their goods and services. And if they could establish political and military control over them, those places, their mission of plunder and of control could be further fortified, bolstered. This was something that they understood. Now, if I want to take over your house or your mahalla, your para, your place, I must justify my action somehow, either as punishment or as an act of kindness. So, act of punishment, you have done something wrong, so I am punishing you by taking over your home, by taking over your place. And then there is also a more subtler kind of reason that I am actually sacrificing myself to help you, civilizing you, giving you a better deal. And you will see that in the case of this particular wave of colonization, religion played a big part. Think about it. When the Muslims came to India, they came here. They fought, they won. And afterwards, they wanted to spread their religion. But when the Christians came, when the Europeans came, they first sent their tradesmen, the traders. Then they sent their missionaries who would give you the good news. Gospel or the Bible is actually good news, good spell. The news of a Godhead, divinity, that is all powerful and all merciful. So there was this white man's burden, as Kipling would call it. Rudyard Kipling would call it the white man's burden. And you see, they represented the rest of the world, excepting Europe, as inferior to and depraved, more depraved than the Europeans. So that was this ideological basis. Similarly, you will see that when the Mughals came here, they did not send tribute to anybody else. They conquered this place. They built up an empire of sorts. But when the Europeans came to any place, the model was different. There was always a bifurcation between the colonies on the one hand and the mother country on the other. So if you are a French colony, France is the mother country. If you are an English colony, England is the mother country. If you are a Portuguese or a Spanish colony, then Spain or Portugal must be your mother country. And there was a hierarchical inequality. Superior mother country and inferior colony. In the case of England, for example, this led to the empire, the creation of an empire, which led to the formulation of imperialism as a discourse. So empire meant that the colonies were under the sway of the mother country, and the colonies constituted what could be called the empire. And that's why when Queen Victoria, after the Sepoy Mutiny or the Great Revolt of 1857, proclaimed herself as the ruler of India, she called herself the Empress of India. Even though she was the Queen of the United Kingdom, she was not the Queen, but the Empress of India. So India was a part of the British Empire. Are you getting my point?
Yes, sir.
Are you getting my point? Just
Yes,
as Chile became a part of the Spanish Empire. Are you getting my point? I hope you are. So first there was the ideological basis. Second, there was a particular time frame. Third, there was a stereotypical representation or typecasting of the colonizers on the one hand and the colonized on the other. The Europeans were active, morally upright, civilized, strong, and so on and so forth. Whereas the colonials, the colonized, were weak, depraved, lecherous, immoral, threatening. So, very clear-cut typecasting of the two sides, the colonizers on the one hand and the colonized on the other. This was there. You have to understand this. Okay. Now, other things need to be taken into consideration. What was that? The colonies had their own knowledge base. They had their own belief systems, their educational system, their medical system, and so on and so forth. And until the arrival of the Europeans, they were comparatively satisfied with their own systems in many cases. In many cases, they were satisfied with their own systems. But the Europeans always tried to impose their own systems onto the colonized. To think about Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe's famous book. You know, Friday was called a Friday. Why? Because apparently he was rescued or miscued on a Friday, which ultimately turned out to be wrong, because while struck by an ague beforehand, Robinson Crusoe had forgotten to take account of a few days, 2 days to be precise. Friday had a native name before this, but he was called Friday. He was taught a new religion, even though he had a religion of his own. He was made to dress in a particular way. And even though he was treated as a child, a mere imbecile, his mind being considered as a kind of a tabula rasa, or a blank sheet of paper, he was also feared. And that's why he was made to sleep in the outer courtyard. And Robinson Crusoe made it certain that Friday could not get at him while he was asleep. So this is a very, very important and interesting differentiation. On the one hand, you consider us, the colonizers consider the colonized as savage, as stupid. On the other hand, you also consider us, the colonizers consider the colonized as menacing or threatening. And this was an inner dichotomy which led Homi Bhabha in Of Mimicry and Man point out that the tongue with which Europe, the colonizers, spoke about the colony was not false but fogged. Now, this is something you have to understand. And today I must also tell you something about the texts and the writers that we are going to tackle in the coming days. First of all, you have to understand that any discussion of the colonial encounter cannot be complete if you don't think about how the colonized responded to this. Previously, I have dealt with how the colonizers thought of the colonial encounter. How did they respond to the colonial encounter? However, in any discussion about the colonial encounter, we must also give proper importance to how the colonized reacted to it. Understood? Now, when we talk about the reaction of the colonized to this, discourse of the colonizers that is encapsulated in and through colonialism, when we think about how the colonized thought back, we are entering the realm of postcolonialism. Because postcolonialism, my dear friends, tries to interrogate as a system of arguments. Postcolonialism tries to interrogate the point of intersection between the point of encounter when one met another. Between what? What do I mean by one and another? The colonizer's ideology and the colonized subjectivity. There must be an encounter. Because when the colonizers came to a particular place, you remember, you read Rabindranath Tagore's famous poem, Africa. এলো ওরা লোহার হাত করে নিয়ে, নখ যাদের তীক্ষ্ণ তোমার নেকড়ের চেয়ে, এলো মানুষ ধরার দল, গর্বে যারা অন্ধ তোমার সূর্যহারা অরণ্যের চেয়ে, সভ্যের বর্বর লোভ নগ্ন করলো আপন নির্লজ্জ অমানুষতা. So obviously they came, the Europeans came to Africa in search of human slaves, fellow human beings whom they would degrade, dislocate, and give a raw deal. Millions and billions of people were taken from various places in Africa, and against their will, against their better judgment, these blacks were transported to far off places to work, to toil and suffer, and that too in utter bondage. No freedom. You could not choose your own life. You could not choose even your own death. I will tell you, frankly, to read a poem by Antonio Jacinto, the Portuguese writer, the poet. Who is that man? Ke sei manushti? And you will understand what postcolonialism tries to do. Postcolonial theorists, postcolonial critics, postcolonial writers, and we as postcolonial citizens, we try to interrogate the version that has been provided to us. Hello? Hello? Classe achi. So they were treated and thought of in a particular light. So we have to understand how the colonizers were perceived, how the colonizers were described, represented by the colonized. And that is what postcolonialism does. Postcolonialism tries to question, tries to point out the gaps, the inherent paradoxes and falsehoods of the colonizers' discourse about the colonies. The way we have been taught by our erstwhile masters, colonizers, to look at ourselves, we are not willing to follow that. We are going to think about how we could perceive them. A famous writer, Chinua Achebe from Africa, had once in an interview talked about the writer's responsibility in the post-colonial context. He said that Achebe's task as a writer was to point out to his fellow Africans, fellow men, compatriots, what? That their past had not been one of unmitigated darkness from which the Europeans came as God sent to deliver them. বলছেন লেখক হিসাবে আমার কাজ হলো আমার স্বদেশবাসীকে এটা বোঝানো যে তাদের অতীত এমন তমসাচ্ছন্ন ছিল না, এমন অন্ধকারময় ছিল না, যা থেকে দেব প্রেরিতের মতো এসে পশ্চিমের লোকেরা, ইউরোপের লোকেরা, এই উপনিবেশ স্থাপনকারীরা তাদের এসে বাঁচিয়েছে। কেন তাদের নিজস্ব শিক্ষা ছিল, সংস্কৃতি ছিল, রাজনীতি ছিল, সমাজনীতি ছিল, all these things were there. They had their own belief systems, their own social constructions, institutions, relationships, their own political dispensations. But the Europeans had tried to reject them summarily as trash, as savage, as bad, as dark, as ignorant, as lecherous, as depraved. Achebe wanted to show himself, his fellow human beings, his fellow Nigerians maybe, his fellow Africans maybe, and also the world at large, that this was a strategy of the Europeans to darken the natives of the colonies. আমি যদি তোমাকে খারাপ বলে প্রমাণ করতে না পারি তাহলে আমার তোমার উপরে আধিপত্য করার কোনো উপায় থাকবে না। If I fail to represent you as my inferior, I will never get the chance to be your boss, to rule you, to boss you, to plunder you. This is what colonialism did, and that is how post-colonialism actually reacted or responded to the European version of history, the European version of anthropology, the European version of philosophy, the European version of sociology, and so on and so forth. Understood? Now, this is something you have to remember, What am I trying to point out? You have to understand, and we have to understand that representation, বর্ণনা, gives the representer a unique advantage over the represented and representee. আমি যদি বর্ণনা করি তোমাকে, আমি তোমাকে ভালোভাবে বর্ণনা করতে পারি, খারাপভাবে বর্ণনা করতে পারি। বর্ণনা, ভাষা মানুষকে এক বিরাট ক্ষমতা দেয়, কেননা ভাষা ছাড়া জ্ঞান, বিশ্বাস, ধারণা কোনোদিন তৈরি হতে পারে না। এই বিষয়টা নিয়েই কথা বলেছেন এডওয়ার্ড সাইড তার ওরিয়েন্টালিজমে, কেননা উনি বারবার এটাই দেখিয়েছেন, হি ওয়ান্টেড টু শো আস, এডওয়ার্ড সাইড ইন ওরিয়েন্টালিজম ওয়ান্টেড টু শো আস the factually incorrect bifurcation of the world into the Occident and the Orient. কেননা আগে পূর্ব আর পশ্চিম বলে আলাদা কিছু ছিল না, আগে আলাদা আলাদা জায়গা ছিল, আলাদা আলাদা দেশ ছিল, জম্বুদ্বীপ ছিল, ভারত ছিল, চীন ছিল, কিন্তু এগুলোকে সবগুলোকে একসাথে পূর্ব দিক প্রাচ্য বলে, ওরিয়েন্ট বলে এটাকে আলাদা করে দিতে পেরেছিলেন হচ্ছে ওই কলোনাইজাররা। The colonizers succeeded in bifurcating the world into us and them, আমরা ওরা, into superior inferior, civilized savage, white and dark. Understood? And you have to understand how colonialism was established and maintained thanks to a stupendous amount of labor, money, and intelligence being spent on this project, this process. Okay? Have you understood this much?
Yes, sir.
But Baba in Of Mimicry and Man wants to tell us about a counter discourse, mimicry. I'm going to talk about mimicry in greater detail later on. But I will finish today's discussion only by talking about a simple thing. You know, just the other day, a Hindi-speaking delivery boy told a Calcutta film director that he has to learn Hindi if he wants to stay in India. क्या बोल रहे हैं बाबू? भारत में रहेंगे और हिंदी नहीं जानेंगे, ऐसा हो सकता है क्या? This is called linguistic domination, linguistic imperialism. And every language, every major language is guilty of this crime, this sin. So what happens? When a chameleon is actually threatened, it becomes mottled. It actually loses itself into the background. Learning to adapt himself or herself or itself to an environment of outside domination. কেন করে এই যে গিরগিটি যে রং পাল্টায়, কেন করে? যখন থ্রেটেন্ড হয়, যখন কন্ট্রোলড হয়, তখন বাঁচার জন্য অ্যাজ এ সার্ভাইভাল মেকানিজম ও ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডের সঙ্গে নিজেকে মিশিয়ে দেয়। দেখো, একটা বাচ্চাকে ভাবো, থিঙ্ক অ্যাবাউট আ কিড। The kid doesn't know anything. He is dependent on his adult or her adult relatives. Understood? Now the kid tries to follow, to imitate, to equip itself with the means of communication, with the means of self-preservation. এবং একটা জিনিস তো আমরা জানি যে আজকে তুমি তোমাদের মধ্যে কেউ বা আমার মধ্যে একজন ধরো আজকে when I am 48 years old now, I can tell you that say 46 years ago I tried to learn language by copying what the others said without understanding the meaning of that. But as I grew, I learned the knobs and stops of language, of communication, and thereby gained power for myself. I was empowered by language. এই বিষয়টা নিয়েই ভাবা of mimicry and man কথা বলবেন. He will talk about this particular aspect in of mimicry and man. Well, with this I come to the end of today's discussion. If any one of you have any questions, I will be only too happy to answer or try to. Hello.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
It is told that Orientalism is the pivotal source of the inaccurate cultural representation that form the foundation of Western thought and perception of the Eastern world. So, my question is, what does the term representation stand for here? Is it indication of domination and control and repression?
See, representation means description, how things are described. Now, when I describe you, I either call you good or I call you bad based on my subject position, based on my knowledge of you. Yes or no? If your interest matches mine, I call you good. If your interest does not match mine, I call you bad. Are you getting my point?
Yes.
So, representation is always mediated by, distorted by what is called self-interest, by what is called ideology. Are you getting my point? The West wanted to colonize, to dominate the East. So obviously the West represented the East in a particular way so as to justify their domination over the East. Are you getting my point? Yes or no? That is what I am telling you, my dear. Any other question?
Sir, I have one. Sir,
Okay.
related to colonialism. So, is post-colonialism the reaction of the people after getting their freedom, or it is before freedom, or in between the freedom struggle?
See, this is a very good question in some ways. You see, when you actually meet me, whether I am a dominating personality, whether I am a ruler, whether I am a boss, you have to respond to me in real time, yes or no? You meet me, you can't say that Bikram Chaudhary will think about Amit Bhattacharya, say 10 years back, 10 years afterwards. Not back, afterwards. You have to respond to me then and there, yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
When the colonized were made by the colonizers, the colonized had to react to the colonizers then and there, yes or no? Got my point?
Yes, sir.
But there is a big but. It was after the withdrawal of the colonizers, it was after the independence of the colonies, that this particular response got currency. Because you could express your ideas, your thoughts, your responses freely without fear, if and only if the erstwhile colonizers were absent or they were incapable of harming you. Yes or no?
Yes,
Have you understood?
sir. So we can say that the voices of post-colonialism were present before they got their independence.
Yes, yes, of course. Postcolonialism was very much active even during the days of the empire. But it was after the independence of the erstwhile colonies that postcolonialism became more forceful, more assertive, and obviously more significant, more powerful. Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Understood?
Yes, sir.
In my
Okay.
next class, I will try to point out. I will get into Edward W. Said and Orientalism, but before doing that, I will try to point out the difference between post-colonialism, post-colonial criticism, and post-colonial theory. Are you getting my point?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. With this, are there any other questions? Is Durba Sarkar present today?
Yes, sir.
Durba Sarkar,
Yes, sir.
you are a good student. The only problem with you is you are not very assertive. I will tell you to try to frame questions, ask questions, and interact more if you want to do better in future. And this is an advice that I will vouchsafe to all of you, all others.
Okay, sir.
Okay, take care.
Okay, sir.